on both the broader issues relative to the Middle East, but more importantly, for the Palestinians. One has to actually first identify that pitting the deal to suspension of the annexation is really a red herring that should be set aside. The reason for this is the following, that Israel has been systematically annexing the Palestinian territories from immediately 1967, but accelerating in the 1970s, and more so actually during the Oslo Agreement. Oslo created the pipeline for Israel's annexation under a whole host of type of structures, whether it's declaring military zones, building colonies and settlements, bypass roads, and the building of the apartheid wall. All these were structures and lands that have been taken from the Palestinians and have been annexed. And then anyone who knows the boundaries of Jerusalem understands that Jerusalem and the boundaries of Jerusalem have been expanded almost 3 to 4 folds from the initial period in 1967. So the question is, what motivated the United Arab Emirates to undertake this major step of opening and intending to have a complete diplomatic relations and recognition of Israel? And is there anything pressing that brought this deal into the fore? And let me say the following. The Arab world leadership has been engaged in a quiet, under-the-table, backroom diplomacy with Israel for the longest period of time. One can actually, even before Israel came into existence, Arab leadership that were in place actually undertook all types of relations with the Zionist movement, as well as relations with the British. The 1936-39 Palestinian major revolt actually was suppressed by the British, but also with the cooperation of Arab leadership. And then the 1948 war itself was a disaster due to Arab lack of support for the Palestinians, not providing them logistical support. The delegation that went to Egypt to secure military equipment for the Palestinians ended up being arrested by the Egyptian government. And as such was not, this is during the King Farouk's period. Even before the 67 war, a number of Arab governments were engaged in behind the scene diplomatic relations with Israel for a variety of reasons. Jordan all along had a backdoor relationship with Israel. Morocco had backdoor relations with Israel, and Gulf states in a variety of different avenues had diplomatic relations. The breakdown of the public part of this normalization pattern comes with Egypt's Camp David Agreement, which really breaks the patterns of Arab leaders engaging diplomatic with Israel behind closed door or in secret. And the signing of the Camp David Agreement breaks this pattern and allows for the first time the major Arab country, Egypt, that has withstood considerable pressure from Israel, at least 3 wars that Israel have pressured Egypt. So that neutralized Egypt from the direct confrontation and direct state of hostility with Israel. And immediately after the Camp David Agreement, Israel had a free hand in attacking Lebanon and in launching its campaign on Lebanon that resulted in the Sabra and Shatila massacres that really can be connected to the Camp David Agreement, where a major Arab country has been neutralized from this ongoing conflict. And Egypt is one of the major hubs in terms of the Arab world. That left the Arab world exposed strategically, with Egypt being neutralized. And as such, the subsequent developments in the region that brought in the possible balance with Iraq, and in essence, Iraq becoming the substitute for the strategic balance that Egypt has provided. And those who followed the event, the Iraqis, I think, committed a major strategic flaw or a major strategic error by actually engaging in the war on Iran, and then the invasion of Kuwait in this sense made it possible for Iraq to be neutralized. Now let me make this following point to you. Both Iraq and Egypt constituted the bulk of the Arab world population. They also constituted the bulk of the strategic balance in the region. And the Gulf states provided the financial support for the confrontation or for the war effort that was present in the region. Knowing that Egypt has been neutralized through a peace process, Iraq has been neutralized through a successive war campaign, both the Iraq-Iran war, and then followed by the US war of 2013, Iraq has been neutralized. And Syria, in essence, can be played into the picture post post-2003. So Syria was still one of the countries that had some level of strategic threat or some strategic balance relative to Israel, even though that Syria has always danced with Israel, creating often open relations, sometimes delivering Palestinians to the Israelis and Americans as a show of good will to open diplomatic and peace negotiations on the backside. So in essence, this left the Gulf states as being the strategic hub for the support, financial support first and foremost, that also have to be sidelined. And this is going back to the 1973 war, where the Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia, using oil as a strategic tool in the confrontation, brought Kissinger to actually think that this possibility of oil being used against the United States in the confrontation with Israel has to be brought to an end. And I think those who are observing the development in the Gulf have to date it back to 73 and moving forward. So that's an important piece in understanding what is taking place in relations to a long-term Israel strategic positioning vis-a-vis the region and the neutralization of any possible threat that would materialize against Israel in relations to the border. So again, that's one part that have to be. Second part is in relations to the Gulf that emerges as a result of the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Post-79, there is a major development that takes place in the Gulf, and the creation of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which actually was created as a security alliance against Iran. But if that was the case, Iraq was pushed out because Iraq was representing Arab nationalism. The United States was operating in what is called dual containment strategy, a containment of Arab nationalism and Islamic political Islam or Islamic fundamentalism that was being represented. So in this sense, the Gulf Cooperation Council made sure that in the articulation of this containment, that Iraq was kept out, and then the beginning of the strategic positioning vis-a-vis Iran. Iran, up to that point, served as a major hub for US foreign policy, what's called the twin pillar foreign policy. Iran being the muscle, Saudi Arabia being the checkbook and providing the financial resources. And from that point on, there was a massive buildup of military infrastructure, a massive buildup for positioning United States advanced forces. That's why anyone who actually woke up after Iraq invaded Kuwait and recognized that 500,000+ US troops were accommodated in Saudi Arabia in a short period of time. The reason they were accommodated is because for almost 20 years, Saudi Arabia was building the infrastructure in there to actually have rapid deployment forces, as well as the United States conducting rapid deployment training with Egypt and other Gulf states to make it possible for this. And as we enter into this period post-Iranian Revolution, the Gulf region becomes the hub of the United States strategic positioning vis-a-vis Iran, but also the region. And Israel becomes the strategic ally in this period, functioning and working to really consolidate its relations behind closed door, in secret relations, to make sure that the regional configuration in relations to the Gulf in particular, but also other countries that came and signed bilateral agreements with Israel, Egypt, Jordan, even if we think about at a distance, Bangladesh, Mauritania. So that becomes the whole realignment in the region where Israel is the strategic ally. It should not be surprising to people that today Netanyahu actually thanked the head of the Mossad for the successful conclusion or the successful agreement that have been reached with United Arab Emirates. And I would say that this relations between United Arab Emirates, I would say also other countries in the region, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, have all been engaged with the Mossad to facilitate the bringing of Israel as the key strategic ally vis-a-vis Iran, as well as the containment of Arab nationalism on the one hand, and on the other is what's called political Islam. So those becomes the two focal point where Israel is a key player in this. And as such, the culmination of signing a deal have nothing to do with Palestine per se, in the sense that Palestinians are not gonna be saved, quote, the occupation is not gonna end, there's no independent Palestinian state, there is no freedom and end of building settlements and annexation. This is specifically of the broader region where Israel now is aligning itself or has reached into an alignment with states that see themselves as the custodians of the region in its post-colonial conceptualization. So to be sure that these are in, ruling elites and ruling families in particular that have assigned or relegated to themselves that they're the custodians of what the Arab and Muslim world should look like, and where are the bases of confrontations that occurs. This takes us into really the Israel integration into the strategic landscape is very, very important and critical. It's a major player in the confrontation that is occurring in Libya, where Israel is supporting Egypt, and to make sure that a post-Arab Spring Libya does not emerge outside of the scope of the desired regional configuration. And we see that the role of the United Arab Emirates in actually launching bombardments on Libya in support of Haftar is something that has to be looked upon and examined in relations to Israel's Israel-Arab elite alignment vis-a-vis the demands and the calls of the mass number of populations across the Middle East and across the Arab and Muslim world that are actually seeking their freedom, seeking dignity, seeking equality, justice, and so on. All these are being really confronted with this scope of relationship. Now, I did not address Yemen, which is also plays into this picture as well, where the engagement both of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, as well as the, I would say, Israel's strategic interest in also neutralizing and making sure that its confrontation or the confrontation in Yemen will come out of an outcome that will be more amenable to the Gulf states as well as Israel, since Yemen holds a very important strategic position on the entrance to the Red Sea, especially on Bab el-Mandeb. And that also gets us into the discussions about the long-term destabilization of both sides of Bab el-Mandeb, both on the side of Somalia, Eritrea, and then on the other side is Yemen. So that has been a process of attempting to make sure that the control of the access to waterways is maintained in the hands of powers and governments that are in alliance with the United States, and by extension also are favorable to Israel's strategic interest in the region. So that's in the sense that the engines for normalization have been taking place for quite a long period of time. Now, I want to take you back a little bit for those who have not followed Arab history for quite some time. There was a confrontation in Yemen in the early 1960s. There was a war in Yemen where Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, as the flag bearer for Arab nationalism at the time, was confronted by the monarchies, in particular Saudi Arabia, that entangled Nasser in a protracted war in Yemen. And in that conflict, actually, records show that Israel actually was supportive of the Saudi Arabia monarchy at the time to weaken and to derail and to confront Nasser. And I know I have my own critique of Nasser and his Arab nationalism and so on, but one should not fail to recognize the dynamics that were underway, that Arab monarchies at the time actually engaged in confronting and neutralizing Arab nationalism, so much so that by the time you get into the 70s, the Arab monarchies actually were able to win the day and push back any type of possible political changes and transformation in the region. And to this extent, one can actually critique also some of the figures, Islamic figures, that also played a role in actually engaging in the confrontation with Arab nationalism at the time, mistaken the ideological differences to the bigger picture of the strategic alignment that was taking place at that particular time. A similar dynamic occurred in the early 70s when Jordan was confronting the Palestinians in Jordan in what came to be known as Black September. And Israel also came to the rescue of the Jordanian monarchy and threatening both the Palestinians and also the Syrians that if they enter into the confrontation, they would actually face the onslaught and the power of Israel. And this was, the nod was given to them also by the United States that such a support will be materializing. So there's a long durée or the long history of these positioning vis-a-vis Israel and the role that Israel played as a regional hegemonic power, supported by the United States, but integrated into the existing power dynamic of, in particular, monarchies and their role in maintaining the status quo against possibly the best interests of their own people, as well as the best interests of the region as a whole. So that dynamic actually gets us into the present circumstances where the deal that is announced is being announced as a step toward bringing about peace or stability in the Middle East. And I think that is far from it. If anything, it's going to be setting the stage for another series of emboldened Israel, as well as emboldened steps that will be taken vis-a-vis possible confrontation with Iran. On another side note, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, participated in the peace negotiations from the time of the Madrid Conference. The Madrid Conference that came as a result in the aftermath of the first Gulf War. The GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, was a participant in the various multilateral tracks. So in this sense, the normalization pattern of the Gulf states with Israel began much earlier than even the Arab Spring or post 9/11, because post 9/11, the jump to try to have a war on terrorism and confront the threat of terrorism, actually the relationship precedes that by a number of years in relation to normalization with Israel. The normalization takes a number of patterns for those who are observing for quite a period of time. The normalization in what's called soft power or soft normalization, beginning with media encounters and media relations. Even those who actually sometimes will look at the role that Qatar played and Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera was the early to break the psychological barrier by normalizing the spokespeople or the spokespersons of the Israeli government on Arabic broadcasts, in this sense to make that there is nothing unique of breaking the psychological barriers and making the norm of bringing Israeli spokespersons to speak from the point of view of the Israeli government to the Arab world. So that is a form of soft normalization that began to have actually an impact, followed by the whole host of normalization in the athletic arena, in hosting various athletic programs and making sure that Israel is brought in relations to many of these athletic competitions, while playing the role that in order to be a major participant in world affairs in the area of sports, you have to be open and non-discriminatory. In the sense in here, normalizing Israel was undertaken by opening the channels through the soft power, and for sure the participation of Israeli athletes became a norm in this sense. Then the trade relations was also followed up, where normalization of trade was taking place in and in the trade relations, I would say that the Palestinian Authority bear major responsibility of actually acting as a bridge to facilitate the integration and the bringing of the Israeli companies. So the Palestinian signing of the Oslo Agreement, followed by the Jordanian-Israeli agreement, created the Arab Bridge for investments, for economic relations, and for normalizations of both the United Arab Emirates, but other Gulf countries that saw Israel as an opportunity for them to become players in the global arena. So that also occurred. The more hard-nosed normalization occurred, but it occurred actually often behind screens and behind closed doors. In particular, the normalization of intelligence gathering, normalization of the intelligence services, and normalization in trainings that began to take shape across the region. So Israel became the go-to experts, in particular post 9/11, and many of the Gulf states leaned on Israel's know-how, similar to how the United States leaned on the expertise, the packaged expertise of Israel, and began to actually partake in training programs. And one of the major training centers was built actually in Jordan, which brought around all of the regional forces, both intelligence and military, and also the Palestinian Authority sent its own personnel to be trained in the Jordanian center, which is one of the largest in the region. So as such, that was another form of normalization that occurred in this announcement. So by the time we get into this announcement, the machinery of normalization by Gulf states, as well as other Arab governments that were seeking a support of Israel, as well as the support of the United States. One have to say that in many circles among Arab political elites and Arab political actors, the notion that the doors to the United States pass through Tel Aviv, that if you wanted to have a strong relations and you want to have relations with the United States, that you need to actually stack your cards relative to Tel Aviv and facilitate some type of relations, either open relations in some of the countries like Egypt, Jordan, Mauritania, and Bangladesh, and even Morocco playing around with, or you play in behind the scene to try to get Israel support and Tel Aviv support for your initiative vis-a-vis the United States. And as such, whether you are trying to purchase military equipment, where you often AIPAC and its power at the Hill would be mobilized to try to block the sales of weapons. Saudi Arabia had confronted that case. United Arab Emirates, not only in terms of weapon sale, but also when they wanted to purchase a port facilities that the Israel lobby in the United States mobilized to block it. So in essence, they got the lesson that instead of confronting the access of Tel Aviv, Washington, and empowering and working to counter it, in essence, they succumbed, whether willingly or unwillingly. Again, I'll leave that to individuals who want to assess. I'm not a psychiatrist to assess whether they're willingly or unwillingly, but the end result is they have played the process of actually going through Tel Aviv to get to Washington. And by the time they arrived to Washington, they basically became assets of Tel Aviv and Israel. And it's not surprising that this accelerated during the Arab Spring, where some of the major Arab actors and major Arab political leadership and governments pumped massive amounts of money into the think tanks, into political lobbying, into political campaigns in order to influence the decision making so they would be supported. So that's the case where the Gulf states put massive amounts of money into US think tanks infrastructure and political hacks in order to get their interest in essence, and to basically demonize and create this perception that we are the trusted hands and you should not allow the Arab Spring or the masses that mobilize into the streets to actually win the day, because if they do, then it will end the long-standing relationship and bonds that have been developed for a long period of time. So that process of normalization have been in existence for quite some time. Now the question, why now? I would say there might possibly a number of possibilities for this. I do think that both Trump and Netanyahu are in a very difficult position. Trump's election possibility is dwindling by the day. His polling data is tanking in a very rapid way. He has not really polled above 41% for a long period of time. The coronavirus has torpedoed any possibility of Trump running on a successful economy. The third quarter of the economic data will actually show the tremendous slowdown. The unemployment is going to continue to tick up in the month ahead. So we're going into an election cycle less than 100 days, and Trump needs something different or something to actually rescue his tanking possibilities. So I think this could be marketed as President Trump having scored a major diplomatic success of having a peace deal that really has no price whatsoever. He doesn't have to provide anything. There is no loss on his part diplomatically. He did not have to invest much diplomatic effort. The statement that they issued, it says over a phone conversation. So again, that it's a phone conversation that have resulted in this major breakthrough from his perspective and the perspective of the announcement. So there isn't much expenditure of both resources and effort from Trump, but on the uptick of it, he would actually market it as a major achievement before the general election. So in this sense, it is something that definitely would benefit Trump, assuming that he packages it correctly and he doesn't shoot himself in the foot, which he is apt to do. He can't keep himself away. So we'll wait and see for the next few days how he's going to tweet about it. But in general, it does have an election tip to it. And I would say that the United Arab Emirates supported Trump in the 2016 election. There is evidence of resources directed and effort mobilized with Trump in the 2016. And for those who followed both the Cambridge Analytica, the Bannon and others, and the meetings that took place with the United Arab Emirates ambassador in Washington, D.C., that the support for Trump was there in 2016, and it was favorable at that point, because the fear that a Democratic president of Hillary being a president, again, I'm not critiquing either way, that the fear was if Hillary become president, that she would be antagonistic to Saudi Arabia, she would be antagonistic to the United Arab Emirates, and possibly would be antagonistic to a Sisi in Egypt, in the sense. Whether those fears are in their place or not, it's history right now. But what is certain is that United Arab Emirates at the time supported Trump financially, and also supported Trump through the mobilization of their assets in Washington, D.C. at the time. So it would be possible to please say that there is a political outcome to it, or a political nod toward Trump in trying to provide him some leverage in relations to the upcoming election, to say that he have scored a successful diplomatic initiative by facilitating this agreement between United Arab Emirates and Israel. Now, on Israel's side, now Netanyahu has been in a very difficult position. He is facing still legal issues for corruption. His hold on power inside Israel is tenuous, that the balance of power in the Israeli landscape is very tenuous at best. And as such, it also provides him for a way to shift the narrative that is around him to a possible that a diplomatic breakthrough, that he has scored another normalization of relations with an Arab country that possibly can provide for him a counter narrative to what is been placed at his foot right now with the corruption charges and the unstable type of coalition that he's holding in relations to the Israeli Knesset. So definitely in here, that's one element relative to Netanyahu. The second is that he found a way out of the massive global opposition to the annexation plan. So in this sense, he could actually, as he announced, suspending the annexation. He did not cancel, he did not say that we will end our annexation, suspending the annexation. This also gives Netanyahu an out, considering that a number of countries announced that they will actually hold Israel responsible. Now, again, whether these countries will do it, it's an academic discussion, and whether France, UK, European Union, or even some of the Arab countries, or OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, whether they'll do something, that's, I would say, it's a subject for debate. But nevertheless, that Netanyahu's announcement of the annexation was met with a massive opposition. And as such, this agreement provides him an out with this out from a place that he have located himself, and in essence provided his opposition, both domestically and internationally, with an upper hand. And more so that in particular in the United States, where some members of the Democratic Party began to actually express that they would actually are interested in linking US aid to Israel to this possibility of annexation. So in this sense, Netanyahu actually, in this sense, finds a way out from his circumstances. Now, what does the United Arab Emirates get is a big question. Let me say the following. Since I would say the period of the late 90s, the United Arab Emirates wants to posit itself as a major global player. Not regional player, not even Gulf player, but a major global player. And part of this is mobilize its resources. It's a rich country. It mobilizes its resources to engage in projection of soft power. It managed to integrate itself into the neoliberal economic model. It accelerated its hyper development in relations to infrastructure, and began to be really a major hub for tourism, a major hub for trade, a major hub for logistical support for the United States forces that were fighting in the region, first Gulf War, second Gulf War, Iraq invasion, war in Afghanistan. It also integrated itself into the various what we call various entertainment, sports, all these elements as a way of projecting itself as a major player on a global level. Simultaneously, it also began to dabble into the different regional conflicts in such a way that it is also to project power. Facilitating support, military support, training, infrastructure. So as we get into the past 10 to 15 years, United Arab Emirates have been engaged and connected to every regional conflict in our region. And in some instances, actually engaged in conflicts that far and distant from its own borders as a way to say that we are playing within the big leagues. To play in the big leagues in the sense is to project that you are powered. The territory is very small, but it's actually to project this power, and began to play that role both as a strategic partner for the United States, but also working to try to become a partner on almost a strategic partner to Israel, in the sense projecting regional influence and power. That regional influence and power was both set up against Saudi Arabia, which was the major power in the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, and therefore it's actually bypassed Saudi Arabia's power and projecting of Saudi Arabia's power both regionally and globally. So in this sense, United Arab Emirates was able to actually locate itself at the hub of political mobilization and political maneuvering, both regionally and globally. So United Arab Emirates began to be a major player in European Union, providing both soft resources and as well as extending contracts for major companies to engage in United Arab Emirates, began to actually have a major imprint on the purchases and facilitation of the soccer leagues, whether it's Spain or in the UK. So that in essence is to locate and to project power on behalf of the United Arab Emirates. But with power also comes entanglement. So the entanglement actually increases and accelerates as we move forward. The entanglement in Syria, the entanglement in Iraq, the entanglement in Yemen, the entanglement in Libya, entanglement in Sudan, in Somalia. So in this sense, it actually begins to complicate and project not a country that is actually going steadily to craft its position globally, but actually entangles itself in the regional conflict as a way to actually authenticate or project itself that it is a major power. What it created is almost a state that is almost having not only split personalities, but multiple personalities in this sense, and trying to craft a role that is beyond the scope of what the state itself and its own resources and its own status can actually project. The last question I want to entangle, what does it mean for the Palestinians? In all honesty, actually, I wanted to Hanan Ashrawi earlier today, she put on both Twitter and Instagram, responding to the post by Mohammed bin Zayed, who said during a call with President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, an agreement was reached to stop further Israeli annexation of Palestinian territories. The United Arab Emirates and Israel also agreed to cooperation and setting a roadmap toward establishing a bilateral relationship, meaning bilateral diplomatic relationship. Hanan Ashrawi responded saying, "May you never experience the agony of having your country stolen. May you never feel the pain of living in captivity under occupation. May you never witness the demolition of your home or murder of your loved ones. May you never be sold out by your friends. So in this sense, I would say her response is very to the point and to the spot. As far as the Palestinians, we have been accustomed to really being situated and sold down the drain, down the drain. I don't like that term, but sold by Arab leadership and Arab governments to score their own deals at the expense of the Palestinians. But let me assure individuals who think that selling the Palestinians for their own benefit to become maybe the new junior partner in a startup of the startup state, or the junior partner of the regional hegemonic power of Israel, or the thinking that maybe that our summer vacation on the shores of the Mediterranean in Tel Aviv will facilitate for us to be accepted as advanced, modern, civilized, and welcomed in Washington, D.C., let me say the following: that no type of agreement with Israel will actually end or transform the Palestinian struggle. Palestinians are facing a settler colonial project that is still unfolding. And Israel can go and make an agreement with every Arab and Muslim government under the sun. And once they come back, they still have to come back and talk to the Palestinians, because we are not going anywhere. It will not end our continued resistance and struggle. It might complicate it. We might have to put the indignity of welcoming or seeing some of the Arab who might come to take photographs in front of Al-Aqsa Mosque and think that they are having achieved anything spiritual. And let me say that visiting an occupied land under the protection of an occupying power goes against the fundamental pillars of Islamic law and goes against any legal opinion in relations to Islamic law, and also violates the standing laws of I would say, the Arab populations across the Arab world, that they see normalization and supporting an apartheid state at the expense of the Palestinians is something that generation after generation have spoken and rejected out of hand. So the Palestinians' situation is not going to be altered one iota in relations. If anything, on the positive end, that the fact that Arab governments are all up and up and in the open alleviates this possibility and this continued double talk, where you actually know that the Mossad is actually recording and been admitted to the hotel rooms before Palestinians arrive to record their conversation, that those days are over, and we exactly at least understand what are the Arab governments and their allies are doing in open daylight. Now, definitely we're going to see other Arab Gulf states coming to the fore. I would not be surprised if Bahrain will also hasten with normalization. Oman already have welcomed Netanyahu last year, so I wouldn't be surprised of a similar type of diplomatic overture. And I know that Saudi Arabia is almost just at the door knocking, and I wouldn't be surprised as a quid pro quo that Israel will help Mohammed bin Salman's dwindling fortunes internationally, and especially in relations to his chainsawing of Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy in Turkey, as well as pursuing the ex-intelligence director in Canada, that a possible quid pro quo might be in there. Not to say that Saudi Arabia leadership is not already looking favorably at possible opening of diplomatic relations. Now, the last part, I would say that this is all being fomented as a way of trying to create a new Middle East. The new Middle East is, again, is to be thought of as recolonized Middle East, even though I don't like the term Middle East itself. It's a colonial construct, but it's a whole colonization that is taking place in front of our eyes. And what we have is really states with flags that really don't have any substantiated level of sovereignty to speak of. So I wanted just for us to really have a commentary on these recent development, and to say that it's nothing in this is for the Palestinians, and to make sure that anyone speak and say that this is going to bring an end to the Palestinian suffering, or that the United Arab Emirates is doing this for the Palestinians. Please just do your own dealings and do your own agreements, do your own, strike your own signatures. But Palestinians have nothing to do with you, and history will actually will judge you in the most harsh way to actually positing and putting this as a step forward for peace or anything relative to end of the Palestinian suffering. So this is what I wanted to say, but if you have any questions, please, by all means. So somebody says, could you elaborate on what you said regarding the term Middle East or the concept Middle East? There's no such thing. The concept Middle East is born out of US or American and British colonial, post-colonial articulation. So the notion that we are from the Middle East, that area is crafted by colonial powers as a sign of demarcation. So in the pre-20th century, what you had is the Muslim world, where different populations that had different cluster of languages and ethnic makeup. So the Arab region having different regions, Bilad al-Sham, Bilad al-Rafidain, or the two rivers, which is Iraq, the Egypt and Bilad al-Sudan, Bilad al-Maghrib, the Morocco, or the term Morocco, Bilad al-Maghrib extended, included Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. So these are the terms that are being in use. So crafting these notions of the Middle East is born out of colonial demarcation. And as this demarcation begins to take shape, it begins to be the focal point of how these terms begin to refer to the region. So another is Arabia. The term Arabia used to be only in reference to what's called the Arabian Peninsula, which would be Saudi Arabia, today United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and then Oman, Bahrain. All this is the Arabian Peninsula and extending all the way to Yemen. So these will be the Arab region, but itself also were considered as part of a larger region. Again, the way we look at the map today, the maps that we are considered, these are really maps that are direct result of the British and the French crafting of this region, coming out of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the treaty post-World War I, San Remo Treaty, that craft this region in the borders that it is. The French and the British have more to do with the type of passport I carry, or anyone in the region carries, the type of second language they acquire. For example, if you're in Lebanon, the second language often was French. Why? Because they were a French colony. The second language in Tunisia is French. Why? It's a French colony. Second language in Egypt, even though that they had an encounter with the French colonial invasion under Napoleon, the British colonized Egypt 1882 and all the way up till the possibly 1953, because King Farouk was under the really the authority and power of the British up to 1953. So the second language is English. Palestine, Jordan is British colonial possession, and therefore English. So not only that, you have the borders were created, the passports were created as a result of this First World War, but also the type of language, the type of educational infrastructure that is there. So for example, in those areas that were colonized by the British, developed a British model of education and continues to be so till today. Regardless what we think about independence and sovereignty and so on, it is still vested heavily in a British or French, and increasingly also you get the American model that is brought in. So that's, it's very, very important to understand the type, we are still in a post-colonial period that is crafted around the colonial process. It says, why can't we have a protest demonstration in front of an Emirates consulate? Again, I think there will be maybe some individuals who will have a protest. It's in Washington, D.C. You don't have consulates all over the United States. There'll be few, maybe there will be one in LA. But in general, the protests have not been directed at United Arab Emirates for a number of reasons. One is there isn't a large diplomatic infrastructure for United Arab Emirates. There will be possibly in DC. So that's, at least in terms of protest, is not there. But also, I also want to make at least a caution for us that while we have opposition to United Arab Emirates' decision to normalize relations, that we need to be very careful that it does not translate for us to actually begin to take oppositional relationship to the population and the people of United Arab Emirates, because I think that in here, the government will try to instrumentalize the possible opposition that arise from rejection of the normalization to try to stoke its own population to see it in oppositional relationship. And I think what here would need to be very clear in opposing the government while also trying to work with various anti-normalization, PDS support within United Arab Emirates, and also to constantly focus on Israel as our primary target. We are opposed to Israeli apartheid, settler colonialism, and so on. So while we engage in focusing and critiquing what is occurring, it is also not to become utilized and instrumentalized in dividing our focus into these, again, United Arab Emirates right now. Jordan has a peace treaty, so Jordan is also have to be critiqued. Egypt has a treaty, Mauritania, Bangladesh. So again, this is part of what I consider to be the Israeli Mossad Zionism, is to actually create divergent strategies or divergent focal point. So you would actually take away your focus from Israel, and Israel goes and say, well, you know, you guys must be wrong because we have all these countries that are supporting us. And again, they will deploy these strategies. What is your involvement? What's your opinion of involvement in Turkey in different, again, there is a regional proxy wars that are taking place. And these regional proxy wars are bringing all these different actors into the fore. United Arab Emirates is involved, Turkey is involved. And in essence, this is what the crisis that we have is, the wasting the resources and the well-being of the whole region in a protracted conflicts. The end result is that empowering Israel as the regional hegemon with the United States behind it. The recent cables that came out as a result of the Canada case shows that Saudi Arabia actually sought and welcomed the intervention of Russia into Syria. So again, when you have such a regional configuration, all the actors are at play. And I'm not in a position to say this actor is versus this actor is, in essence, is their action is valid or not valid, is that what you have is a regional proxy wars that are being fought, and each of the regional actors are positioning themselves both to protect themselves, one, but also is to position themselves in a different strategic position vis-a-vis other actors in there. So again, this is the landscape that we are dealing with. I am more critical of Gulf states in both in terms of Syria and Libya, because they actually played a very decisive role in preventing a possibility of transformation from taking place, and it continues to be the case. And they're using the boogeyman of the political Islam as a way to try to cover their massive engagement in the region. I think at the end of the day, if analysis is correct, their primary concern and primary focus is to save their seats of power at all costs and at all expense, even if it leads to the destruction of the whole region. That is the primary focus, and I don't see any other focus from that whatsoever. Is it time to call on Palestinian leaders across the world to join hands in formulating a Palestinian? I'm always calling for a Palestinian government in exile. We do need to really reorganize our political house. It is still in a very unorganized, collapsing state. A Palestinian Authority has lost all credibility. It has no levers of power to use. It has disconnected itself from the Palestinian diaspora, and it lost much credibility over the past 20 plus years. So I think the first item of business is for us to reorganize our political house, and I am in favor of an actual government in exile that lays claim to sovereignty over Palestine as a political act that we all rally around. And I think this is something that we need to do. Deborah, in the past, members of Arab royal families who tries to visit Al-Aqsa were found out by the Palestinians, who then shamed them and kicked them out. Are tactics such as this a way of exposing, normalizing Arab powers internationally and to their... I am a person that calls the Palestinians, if you're in Jerusalem, if you're in Beit Lahem, if you're in Khalil, if any Arab visitor comes supported and protected by Israel to the visit, I would say that you should not welcome them, you should shame them, and I would say that Islamic law is on your side for making sure that this is not the case. Palestine is not a tourist destination for those who violate Palestinian rights and those who actually would opt to dance with apartheid and settler colonialism. It is not a photo op. There are about 192 different countries where you could actually go and take a photo op. Go to France and take a photo op in front of the Eiffel Tower. Go in front of Big Ben in London. Go to the Colosseum in Italy or in Greece. Go into various parts of the Muslim world. Go to Mecca and Medina. Take a pictures in there if you want, or any of the other regions in the world. There's about 1 million other places. Go to Cairo, to Mozambique, to Zimbabwe, Senegal. There's a whole host of other people. So when you come and trod your own self to try to take a selfie in Al-Aqsa Mosque while you're protected by the Israeli soldiers who are inviting you and giving you a VIP, this is, for me, is completely unacceptable. And I would say individuals who encounter these individuals, and I know there were some kids in Palestine that have far more sophistication about the political analysis, and they rightly chase many of these individuals out because they're not coming to visit. If you're coming to visit, and if you want to visit Palestine in solidarity with the Palestinians, we'll be more than happy to welcome you if you're coming to be in solidarity with the Palestinians. But don't come into a VIP type of visit supported by Israel, normalizing your relationship with Israel and then trying to say that you're coming in there to visit Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is actually a diminishment of the struggle of the Palestinians to do so. Said these are all shayateen joined against Palestine for their own interests, but isn't the PLO extremely corrupt as well? What is the solution? Well, again, I'm a very strong critic of what the PLO has become and where it ended, the signing of the Oslo Agreement, and even before that. And I think Palestinians, we do need to put our political house in order in order to do so. And these are in urgent times that requires for us to take the needed steps in there to make that change. What can we do? Again, you still need to organize. I am for and supportive of the PDS movement. The boycott divestment movement. We still need to double our effort. In the United States, we need to make our voices louder and clearer. We need to contest every arena in civil society in relations to PDS. We need to mobilize on college campuses, support the students who are initiating these boycott, divestment, and sanction. Make sure that we continue to build those movements to effect change, make sure that to actually support any political figure that comes out in support of the PDS and rally around them. So it's very important to do so. And I think those individuals in the United States recognize that AIPAC has lost 4 of the contests that they have pumped massive amounts of resources. They attempted to unseat Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. They supported their opposition in Ilhan Omar's case. They outspent her 6-1, pumping $3.5 million, at least is my figures correct, but she actually defeated the AIPAC candidate by, I think it's 59 to 39, almost by 20 points. So that's a very, very important. They targeted her because she supported Palestinian rights. She did not step away from the PDS position. And same as Rashida Tlaib, they actually pumped money to her opposition. They actually recruited somebody to run against her, putting on the table $1 million to recruit someone to run against her. So the AIPAC is no longer in a position to be uncontested. It's being contested. And I think this type of work needs to actually continue and build upon in various parts. So the status of PDS, I mentioned about it. Now we still need to push for more for the PDS movement. I would say we need to approach the various unions for them to embrace. We need to have it at the local level, at city councils level, and begin to push for that. We need to also begin to focus a little bit more at the college campuses to make sure that many of these programs, study abroad programs that are being entangled with sending students to Israel that have to be challenged. I know a number of these programs where you actually take students and they are funded to go to Israel. So I think what we need is to make sure that these are continued to be engaged at. So let's see, I have somebody on here. Alliances, again, we are all for building alliances, to build alliances with all the progressive forces that are working in various. Also, there are some actually within the churches, communities, the Presbyterians, even the Anglican, the Lutheran churches, all are mobilized to support the Palestinians. So this is a very important moment of both connecting what we're doing domestically to the transnational. I think the work around Black Lives Matter, the pointing of the police training programs that take police officers to train in Israel has to be challenged. And I think just recently, the whole campaign to point out the insidious role that the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, plays in sending police officers to train in Israel, and therefore taking ADL to task, which posits itself as a civil rights organization, which is not a civil rights organization. It's actually protecting Israel organization, and it's really the free speech police when it comes to Israel and critique of Israel. So I think these are the moments where these alliances and relations are very critical to point and to continue to build around them. Hani says, do you agree with Sean King that Kamala Harris is now more progressive than she was? Kamala Harris is a law and order person. Whether she's moved on certain issues post George Floyd's murder is to be seen, but I don't want to be caught in thinking that Kamala Harris and Biden are going to be transformative leaders for this country. The notion that any top ticket or the president and the vice presidents are going to make that transformation has to be set aside. What we need is to actually put our mobilization on our focus on the issues, and to see if Kamala Harris adopts those issues that we advocate for. And if she does, then she could be judged as being progressive or moved. If not, then we have to continuously mount the pressure and mobilization for it. And again, I would say we need to verify where she's at and what is taking place. On Palestine, both Biden and Kamala Harris are very close to AIPAC and are, in essence, are not going to stray away from AIPAC's line, which puts the onus on us to mobilize, to push them away, to say that speaking AIPAC speech and continue to have framing of the Palestine issue in the Democratic Party through AIPAC's lens is over, and that's something that we have to bring to the table by continuing to organize both locally, regionally, and nationally. And this is not the end of the story. AIPAC maybe have gotten its say with Biden and Kamala Harris, but this is a long-term struggle. It's not one election or one campaign. It's a long-term, and change is coming. And for those who are not used to it, I would say you better get used to it, because it is there and it is happening, despite what everything that we are seeing underway at this point. Do you feel there is a split in the pro-Palestine movement over the situation in respect to? Absolutely. Again, I was a critic of President Assad before even the Arab Spring. I was opposed to Assad from the time of the Tell al-Za'atar massacre and the Tell al-Za'atar attacks on the Palestinians in Lebanon, where Syria played a very dirty role in actually coming into Lebanon at a time where the Palestinians and the Lebanese nationalists were about to win the war. Syria came in at the time with Assad the father and basically attacked the Palestinian camps, attacked the Tell al-Za'atar camp, and massacred individuals, and those who survived loaded them up in buses or trucks and sent them outside the country. So the history of the Syrian Assad government is not to be celebrated. And I know in here some of those who work with some of the progressive factions in, not progressive, but some of the leftist factions, the Palestinian PFLP, DFLP, they hold that Syria is the beacon of progressive politics in the Arab world. And I would say really it's not the case. Syria have delivered to Israel a number of leaders, Palestinian leaders, either for assassination or giving them as a show of goodwill to say that we are engaged in relations. So all of a sudden, because somebody opposed the United States does not immediately make the person a celebrated, what you call, beacon of freedom in the Arab world. This is not the case. Is he better than X, Y, and Z? Yeah, you could make the analysis. He's good, better than X, Y, and Z. But we should not delude ourselves to think that the Assad family and the Assad regime has been the key supporter of the Palestinians. If the extended support for the Palestinians, it was a strategic positioning while accounting for the Syrian population. Again, we have to make a distinction. The Syrian population have always been behind and supportive of the Palestinians, despite the machination of the Assad regime. The Arab Spring became entangled, and I think that the Syrian civil war resulted in bringing all the regional actors to settle their accounts on the Syria's landscape. So it became an Iranian, Saudi, Gulf, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, Turkey, Russia, the United States, European Union, all have agreed, or at least tacitly agreed, to use the Syria's landscape as the place to settle their account and to fight a proxy war. The end result of it is the Syrians are its own victims, and everyone actually puts the flag that they're defending the Arab and Muslim world. And I would say that if anything, the Arab and Muslim world are the primary victims of what is occurring. And on top of it, then we begin to engage in these debates and discussions about how Syria is the last bastion of defending the Arab world against imperialism. And again, these are ways that we evaluate the momentary just because somebody's positioned vis-a-vis the United States. And I think what we need is to both be opposed to the United States imperialist colonialist policies as well as Europeans, but also as much as opposed to Russian intervention, as well as the various Arab regimes and leaders in the region. They all have failed the Arab world, and they all have failed their societies. And we continue to actually, they are gonna fight their way to keep their seats to the last Arab person or Muslim person that is standing. And you know, how you define failure? It's like, really, can we just sit back and say, just from my just my lifetime, just think of how many Arab and Muslims have just been killed by all these machinations that are taking place. And on top of it is like, do you really have to put a picture of a person up there to say that he represents the hopes of the Arab and Muslim world? It's like, you know, at least just understand what a catastrophe that we have been facing, both because of the colonial powers, also because of the major superpowers, the United States and Russia, and now in the post-colonial, post-Cold War, the Europeans, the United States, Russia, and the Arab and Muslim leadership, they're all just constantly engaging in machinations to maintain and protect their own narrowly constructed self-interest at the expense of the population. And in this sense, also, this constant pressure on the Palestinians is that you need to articulate your positions on Assad or Syria. It's like, what else? If there's anything that you should not ask the Palestinians, don't ask them to take what you call, to articulate a position vis-a-vis which country or which leader in the Arab world. Because at the end of the day, every time there's a conflict, we ended up holding the bags for the conflict that is there. You know, I remember when Egypt and Libya got into a tiff, they ended up putting the Palestinians on the border, as if like, who wants to have what type of price to pay. So for me, this notion of the splitting of the Palestinian activists around this issue, I think is very, very problematic, short-sighted. And I would say the demands that are being made of the Palestinian is also very wrong and unprincipled in general. And to make the litmus test this aspect is highly, highly problematic at this time. What are your thoughts on Biden? Well, Biden and Harris most likely received the AIPAC talking points, and that's basically what they're reflecting. So most likely they got those talking points. Maybe the head of the AJC, American Jewish Committee, maybe the ADL and a few others called on Biden and Harris, and that's basically the statement. So they're not really thinking or articulating a position that comes uniquely from what you call their intellectual vision of the world. This is AIPAC speak for anyone that knows how things move. So I took a lot of your time, so hopefully this has been beneficial. Thank you for joining me. On August 28th, I will be having Dr. Mitri Rahib, who's going to be joining us for a conversation to address really the issues relative to Palestine. In particular, I want to discuss with him the situation of the Christians of Palestine, but more importantly, the Cairo's Declaration, which is the declaration of the Christians of Palestine as well as Christians of the East in relations to the Palestine and what is their position. So please make sure to join us for that. So thank you and good evening, and look forward to seeing you in different settings in the future.